It's Friday, the 16th of December, 2022.
The last word in podcasting news. This is the Pod News Weekly Review with James Cridland and Sam Sethi.
I'm James Cridland, the editor of Pod News.
And I'm Sam Sethi, the host of Sam Talks Technology.
In the chapters today, Spotify's 2022, Apple's 16.2 changes, greater adoption of OP3, and lots of highlights of 22 and predictions for 23.
This podcast is sponsored and hosted by Buzzsprout. Last week, 3,248 people started a podcast with Buzzsprout. Podcasting hosting made easy with powerful tools and remarkable customer support.
From your daily newsletter, the Pod News Weekly Review.
But first, James, let's start off. There is still a little bit of news in 2022, surprisingly. Spotify is putting out some more trends, it seems, for 2022. It says if the story for 2021 was content explosion, then 2022 is one of diversification. What are they talking about, James?
Well, they're talking very much around their podcasts, which is exciting to have a full podcast trends report. They end up saying that the time spent listening to podcasts via Spotify in car has more than doubled. Smart speakers, smart TVs have seen more than 80% increases. Health and fitness is the fastest growing category on Spotify in 4 of the largest markets. French listeners more than trebling the amount of time that they listen to health and fitness podcasts. I wonder whether that's just that there's a really interesting health and fitness podcast in the platform. Who knows? And Chartable data suggests that true crime is the most effective genre for cross-promotion, which is interesting. I wonder why that might be.
No idea on that one, personally. But I was thinking, given your radio background and mine, in car, I mean, I do listen to podcasts in car. I very rarely listen to, apart from talk radio stations. Is podcasting finally biting into the radio audience?
I think podcasting has been biting into the radio audience for some time. There's some really good research, which I link to occasionally from Pod News, from Radar. It's called the Midas study. And what that looks at is various things. But one of the pieces of data in there is how many people are using podcasting or radio or, Spotify, those sorts of music services at any given time during the day. And you can actually see that, particularly at breakfast time, which is supposed to be the big time for radio, then you can see that nearly 50% of people are consuming podcasts at breakfast time. Radio is still massive. Radio is still considerably larger. But about half of the audience of radio, I should say, are listening to podcasts at breakfast time. So it's certainly getting there. And as you go in through the rest of the day, there is a point in the evening where more people are listening to podcasts than the radio. Which I think is quite interesting. Of course, Spotify will be delighted about that sort of data because Spotify see themselves very much, as do Acast, as against radio and pro on demand.
And again, I just think, have you managed to get the Alexa speaker to work really well with your flash briefing, your daily briefing?
Not my Alexa speaker, because I don't have, well, I do have one. It's in a drawer. It's gathering dust.
Okay.
But the Google one, I use, yes, it does a daily briefing every single morning. It's the first thing that we hear as we wake up. I had to turn it away from the local ABC station because the local, everybody's on holiday now because it's the big summer holiday here. Everybody's on holiday. And the person that they've put on the ABC breakfast show here is suboptimal. So I've switched over to a mate of mine who's on one of the commercial stations. My goodness, the amount of commercials they play. But yeah, so it works pretty well from that point of view, but only for certain shows. So it works well for the Pod News Daily podcast, for example, where we do very, very well out of that. But I can't imagine anybody consuming a long-form podcast like this on a smart speaker.
Well, you'll be glad to know my Alexa morning brief when I get up in the morning Good morning, Alexa. Plays your flash briefing. There you go. I get you first thing in the morning.
There's a lovely thing. Moving on quickly, coming back to Spotify.
Yes.
It's not all rosy in the garden, though. Spotify live shows, they've been spending quite a lot on live audio this year, and all of those are being cancelled, according to Ashley Carman, a really good piece from her in Bloomberg. And Spotify is also, this was according to a Swedish tech website that I found and auto-translated, but Spotify is apparently telling its employees that they can't go to conferences in 2023, they can't have any off-site meetings, they can't do non-essential travel. All of that is being cut. There's a real cost-cutting thing going on at Spotify at the moment. We were talking earlier on this year about Acast really, cutting down and making sure that they get into profit faster, and that appears to be what's going on in Spotify as well.
Has Elon Musk overnight taken over Spotify? Did I miss that?
Oh, can you imagine it? Can you imagine it?
Well, I'm really gutted. Does that mean there's no Spotify party that I can break into this year at Vegas?
Yes, because you managed to get in. They don't allow anybody from the press in, because they clearly hate us all. I wonder why that might be. So, but you managed to sort of permeate the Spotify defences, didn't you? That won't be happening again.
Well, they don't know who I am, you see. I'm not as famous as you, so it's okay. I just sort of sneak in the back door. Anyway, Spotify Live being cancelled, Jane. I mean, they've only had it for 30 seconds and they did nothing with it. I mean, why cancel it?
Yeah, I mean, they ended up buying, I think this, again, is the big fault of the investment industry. Because investors are very keen that Spotify would copy Clubhouse and build its own Clubhouse. So Spotify goes to build its own Clubhouse or buys a thing in, which they rebrand as Spotify Green Room and then pull into the app itself. And hey presto, nobody uses it. And so instead of giving it the benefit of the doubt, they end up closing it, I think, within about 18 months, I think, in total. I do wonder how much of this is actually just driven by dumb stock market analysts who basically turn around to Spotify and say, why aren't you investing in things like Clubhouse? And Spotify says, all right then, go on then. And I wonder whether it's just a keeping your stock market price higher thing.
Well, it may be, but I think they could have used it so well with new album launches, getting artists in, getting them to talk about the album, play some live tracks, and then charging them with ticketing. Don't know. That's how I would have used it. It would have been a great service. But hey, goodbye, Spotify Live. It was nice not knowing you. Now, moving on. Apple's been doing a few things. Apple iOS 16.2 came out, and also on the desktop updates and iPad. They've clearly now changed something, James. They've made one massive little change. What have they done?
Yes, it is one massive little change. If you used Apple Podcasts, which I don't, obviously, because it's not on Android, although they must be working on an Android app because they're not stupid. When you look at the Apple Podcasts app, up until last week, there was a plus button at the top, and the plus button was actually how you would subscribe or follow to a podcast. What they've done there is that they've changed that plus button, so it still says plus on it, but it now has the magic word follow after it, because they've realised that there's enough space in the UI to be a little bit more obvious. So now that button is very clearly marked follow, and I noted that Spotify also uses follow. So between those two, more than 2/3 of podcasts are being consumed on a service that uses the phrase follow. Now, quite a lot of us still use the phrase subscribe. Come and subscribe to our podcast. But of course, that's not necessarily the right wording, given that 2/3 of people are actually seeing the word follow. Listeners follow shows to add them to their library or receive new episodes or be notified when they're available. They can subscribe to support their favourite shows and unlock premium audio experiences, or at least that's what Apple would like us to think as well. So I posed the question, is it time, firstly, just to check that we are using the word follow and not subscribe? But also, secondly, should we be asking other podcast apps, Pocket Casts, for example, or Google Podcasts, to follow suit and to use the word follow instead of the word subscribe. What say you, Sam Sethi?
Well, I'm going to have a little rant now. I think this is super short-sighted. One of the things that I want to see in 2023, I'm jumping ahead slightly, but I'll pull myself back, is I want to see more social interactivity. I want comments. I want cross comments. I want people to follow. The best way of discovery in podcasting is word of mouth. You tell me some great podcast, or you put it in a chart, or you write about it, and I go and follow it. Now, I get that. That's what I've been doing. But if we have to now use the word follow and subscribe, there is no space left in the lexicon for when we want to add a social layer to podcasting. How do I follow James Cridland? What's the word going to be? So I feel like some person in Apple marketing has basically misappropriated the words, said, right, we're going to have follow for this, subscribe for that, because we need a word for our subscriptions and channels. And they've just decided randomly and unilaterally to change the whole industry wording. And they've left no space for when I know a few apps that are coming will add a social layer. And what's the word they're going to have to use? Follow a person, which is standard de-rig for all social media, can't be used because it's now follow a podcast.
Well, can you not do both? Can you not follow a podcast and follow a person?
You can, but it's nice as a verb entity, sorry to be technical, so that you can delineate between the two. I want to follow this person. I want to subscribe to this podcast. And basically, that's how I would prefer it to be. But there you go. Who am I to say?
I mean, the way that Apple has always approached this industry is that it's their industry and they will make all of these changes, and that's basically how that's going to work. But I have to say, if 2/3 of, it's not just Apple, it's Spotify as well, and if 2/3 of the consumption platforms out there are already using the word follow, I'm there wondering, surely if you're in charge of Pocket Casts or Podfriend or whoever it might be, surely it makes sense to use the word that more and more podcasters are going to be using, follow this podcast. And I think it's just going to be a little bit confusing having subscribe meaning something different in different apps.
Well, a lot of apps are already doing. I mean, if you look at Fountain, they already have follow because they follow people. They have a social layer already. And they still have follow a podcast. So they're going to have to change that to subscribe to a podcast. But I don't think it's a payment mechanism that they're going to be using. Apple's done this because they wanted to actually add subscriptions. And the payments were involved. So subscribe is what we'll call it. We'll see. 2023 is coming. You can vote with your feet or with your fingers. We'll see whether people adopt it, won't we? We'll see whether people go, I'm subscribing to Pod News Weekly or Pod News Daily. We'll see whether they say that or follow. We'll see. Yeah. Now, moving on. Brand safety. Barometer and Oxford Road have rolled out 2 new brand safety and suitability solutions for audio advertisers. Unpack that sentence, James.
Yes, because it's quite a sentence. It's the top of their press release, which I covered yesterday. And I was curious. I know that the idea of brand safety is something that not everyone is bought into. I mean, I don't know whether you've heard Todd Cochran on his many rants recently on the New Media Show about brand safety. But from that point of view, he's clearly not bought into that. I have a feeling that Adam and Dave have their views on there as well. But these companies have worked together to launch a couple of things in that space. So rather than just opine about them, I thought I would chat to the people concerned and find out what they actually were. So here's Dan Granger from Oxford Road and Tamara Zubati from Barometer.
Barometer is an AI-powered brand suitability and contextual targeting solution for podcast advertisers.
And Dan, Oxford Road is a train station in Manchester, which I've used occasionally, and it's very nice. But you're not from a train station.
It's Oxford Street. I get a lot of Google alerts about that area.
It's Oxford Road in Manchester. It's Oxford Street in London.
Really? Yeah. It's real. It's a real place. Well, there's also one in Michigan.
There you go.
That's the reason that I called it that. So I just stole it. No, Oxford Road is the leading independent agency focusing on podcast and audio as a channel.
So, Tamara, what have you announced this week?
So this week we announced the release of two new features and tools. One of them actually you already helped us showcase. That was the host intelligence solution. And we did release it for the new month. So we have 5 new episodes that we have scored in depth and provided like searchable interactive transcripts for anybody to check out the level of detail that Barometer's analysis powers for the GARM components. And then our second exciting announcement is our host intelligence solution, which is a brand new tool that we're rolling out based on popular demand for our kind of preview version of it that already existed in Barometer, where we score how a host, in this case, any entity, is portrayed over 50,000 news sources on a daily basis.
So, Dan, some of the brand safety solutions announced by others have focused on the show's content, but Barometer Host Intelligence is all about the host, the talent, the personality. Why is that person important to you as an ad agency?
Well, what we've figured out is that we have a certain level of responsibility for the environments we place our clients in. But sometimes we limit that discussion to just what is said in the show. And as it turns out, there can be a lot of challenges for brands that affiliate with a show that may be safe, but the host is not for reasons that happen outside of the show. So we get a sudden emergency email that a host we're sponsoring was caught wearing a shirt that said something controversial in the wild. And all of a sudden, this is a topic. So if you thought that you're only responsible for the show, you are not. You are responsible for the behavior of that individual to some people, to some stakeholders. And so really important that you get visibility into that as well as what's in the show itself.
Wow. I mean, are there any examples that wearing a shirt can't be a proper example, can it? Let's just take a quick break.
We need to change the way we address our nation's issues. It's time to problem solve. We no longer have time to entertain divisive rhetoric that has polarized and divided this nation. I problem solve through very simple means: common sense, logic, reasoning, decency, and most importantly, the truth. I am not here to promote anyone's political agenda. We must realign our thinking. We're the most resilient nation in the history of civilization. We have the ability to stop on a dime and change direction. We need the leadership to do so. I'm concerned we're running out of time. My name is Lou Palumbo, and this is Between the Lines.
No, that's a real example. Absolutely. Yeah, there was a podcaster who wore a shirt that didn't make any sense to me. Not something I would have recommended that they wear, but they were wearing it and someone snapped a picture. Somebody put it on the internet and Twitter was ablaze. So that's not the only example we have, but truly people trend for all sorts of reasons. People get upset with a personality for all types of reasons. And, you know, I think in the early days, we might have imagined that it was exclusively about what's said on air and then their personal life is their personal life. But we don't live in that world anymore. And so that's not to say that we advocate for disassociating with programs because of every behavior that a talent is accused of conducting or conducts. But it is helpful to be aware of it so that sponsors and listeners can be eyes wide open with their affiliations and what they're consuming.
Now, Tamara, Barometer's podcast Suitability Spotlight, that's a free and open service for all advertisers. It'll be published in Pod News. What can people expect from that list? What's the list of?
So every month we will showcase the newest available episode of 5 total shows. 4 of them will be from the Edison Top 50 for that quarter. And then 1 of them will be showcasing a diverse or underrepresented creator. So it doesn't have to be in the top 50, but we've sourced, we actually worked very closely with Oxford Road's team to source a list of creators and shows that we want to spotlight alongside the top 50.
I mean, it's a very divisive world out there. Some people might accuse you of telling us what's right and what's wrong. Are you doing that, or is that list a little bit different?
I think it's I think of it like a mirror. Like there's really not that many, or Dan also likes to call it a nutrition label. There's not that many, like reflections of the content that we're ingesting, and yet every piece of content that we ingest permanently affects how we view the rest of the world forever. And so I think that it's really interesting, not just for people in our industry, but also like anybody who wants to look at kind of the breakdown of the content that they're ingesting across different parameters, like adult content or like profanity. And it might be things that people don't even recognize that they're ingesting. And then you get into kind of the more, I don't want to call it like contentious, but like interesting components like debated sensitive social issues or crime, and kind of just reflecting month over month, looking at episodes from different shows, kind of what are some of the differences even within one genre, showcasing differences of the same kind of level across both sides of the political spectrum in the US kind of political spectrum. So it gives us an opportunity to showcase a variety of content and help people understand that suitability is in the eye of the beholder. And it's very different from safety, where it's kind of a binary, and this helps people and brands and people who create content really understand their content in a new way.
So Dan, these are signals, right, that help you choose what podcast you're going to advertise in, and I guess it's up to you at the end of the day where you spend your money.
Yeah, well, and to be fair, it's not my money at all. Really, we're stewards of our clients' money, and I think one of the beautiful things about the partnership between Barometer and Oxford Road is a foundation of shared values. And one of those values is that we want people to be able to communicate openly and freely, but we don't want there to be no way of evaluating what the consequences of that content is. And so I don't think any of us see it as our job to police or to say this is good or this is bad. It's to identify what are our values, what are the values of our clients, and can that be congruent with the media selection that is made before they make a purchase, to see a through line of values all the way to the consumers that they're reaching in a show. So we didn't come up with the GARM definitions, but I think we have agreed that they are good enough to provide a third-party perspective so that brands can just be aware and make a more informed purchasing decision. Because what we saw before was a lot of very arbitrary rules, things that weren't based on shared standards. So a lot of feelings and a lot of guilt by association. And ultimately, people were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to see major brands and sponsors defunding news and opinion. And that was what was starting to happen. What we want to see is them support the ones that are having healthy, productive discussions and move away from those that are just pushing people toward the extremes.
So what ultimately are you both hoping this will do to the industry next year? Tamara?
Yeah, so I think our goal is to bring more transparency and shared good data that people across both sides, the buy side and the sell side, can use to make more data-driven decisions, whether that means opening up content within categories that were previously excluded, like news, or comedy or true crime, or helping advertisers feel more confident in new investments that they're making in shows that they weren't buying before, helping them find new shows that meet their standards that they didn't know met their standards, and kind of just creating a bigger atmosphere of more open-mindedness that the data and the transparency can really power. And like part of the reason that we've neglected or actually intentionally not designed a score from like 1 to 100 for each of the shows is it's like relative to what? For one advertiser, a certain combination of the GARM components means one thing, and for another advertiser, that same exact combination means something completely different. So I think, open-mindedness and transparency.
And Dan, where do you see this data taking the industry?
So I think there's two things. One is, I think, being achieved already for all Barometer users, which is buyers and brands can feel much more confident that their values are being fairly represented through their associations and what they support. That's the first thing. The second thing that I think is the larger goal we're trying to move toward is shifting the incentive structure in the industry to go away from rewarding the loudest voice and just trying to make the person who makes the most noise make the most money. And we're trying to say, how do we incentivize with real cash, having a healthy discourse? How do we have productive dialogue about important topics, not shy away from topics, but pay attention to how responsibly those topics are handled? And if we can move the carrot over to that, I think that we're going to see a lot of benefits in our culture as well as for our bottom lines.
Well, Dan, Tamara, I wish you luck with that. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
We are going to move on and talk about some of mine and James' highlights for 2022 first. It's been a great year for podcasting, another growth year. Some of my highlights and lowlights is what I'm going to rapidly run through. It was hello and goodbye to Facebook before we even knew you. James uncovered secretly somehow, I don't know how you did it, James, but you got YouTube's 2022 business plan. But strangely, they never executed on it because we've never seen YouTube podcasting. And rumours are that there was going to be Twitter and TikTok podcasting. I don't think Elon's that interested. So that was one of my first highlights. One thing that I thought was great, Benjamin Bellamy did at the beginning of the year, but doesn't seem to have been used much, was a podcast font. Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces, oh my, they came, they caused noise. Everyone followed everyone. It became a follow fest, but they all disappeared. Are you still using Twitter Spaces, James?
I'm using Twitter Spaces once a week. I'm not really logging into Twitter anymore because Elon Musk is a fool. But I'm using Twitter Spaces once a week. There's a podcasting power hour that happens to be at 11 o'clock in the morning for me here, and it's quite good. So I will use that. I will normally dip into that and have a listen to what they're talking about every single week, but that's basically it. Have you used it at all recently?
No, I can't be bothered with it. I look for a few. There's a couple. I think Ariel's done a few. There's a few others I occasionally dip in on, but I've never got up on stage for them. You'd think I was shy or something, wouldn't you? There you go. No, I think the highlight for me of 2022 was actually getting out after COVID. 2 events. Podcast Movement in LA was great. Had a wonderful time out there, seeing and meeting some of the people we talk about every week. So thank you to Harry Duran and a few other people out there who took me under their wing and introduced me to lots and lots of people. And the highlight in London was the London show, the first one they did. That was very good. I'm looking forward to this one in 2023. And for me, I thought one of the nicest things was you and I, organised a little pub drink around in a 17th century pub down an alley mews right behind Buckingham Palace. And that was
in the middle of nowhere.
In the middle of nowhere in central London.
But yes, that was great fun and really nice and different, which was a good thing. I should say, this week I have learnt that there is a new brew pub in Las Vegas called Brewdog, which I'm very excited by. So that only opened last week. So that might be a venue at Podcast Movement in Las Vegas in March. So looking forward to that. And of course, we will both be, I'm sure, at the podcast show in London when that is back on in May.
Yeah, we will. And lastly, before we get on to James's highlights, one of the big highlights for me was the value tag, the ability to add micropayments, Satoshis, into podcasting and make that much more live. And Alban was the wallet that I suddenly got to understand all of this madness around invoices, which looked like QR codes when I first looked at them. So yeah, the value tag and Alban is probably my tech of the year in terms of podcasting, and obviously, as I said, the events with Podcast Movement and the London show. James, come on, give me your highlights for 2022.
Yes, I think my highlights in terms of sort of growth of the industry, I think the growth of Podcasting 2.0 has been very exciting, and some of the new features there. It's been sort of frustratingly slow in some ways, but really fast in others. And it's really good to see RSS being seen as something that has new life, something that is extendable. It's always been extendable, but it's really good that people have grasped that and understood that you can do additional stuff with the RSS feeds that you have. You don't need to go and build something else. And I think that that's been very exciting. I'm also very excited by OP3. They open analytics, because I think for those people people that go into it and use it, I think it will be a very much more transparent and open way of basically saying, no, this is what I'm doing on my podcast. This is how many people are listening. This is what's going on it. And I'm very excited by it. Hurry up, John, and build the additional APIs. But really, really cool. So very excited by that. And I think, as part of that, I think that actually what Elon Musk has shown us and what the failings of Facebook has shown us and everything else is that open data is really important and really beneficial to the industry as a whole. So if you have a look at Twitter versus Mastodon, if you have a look at Spotify versus RSS, actually understanding that openness is a helpful thing and interop is a helpful thing is really exciting. So I think all of that has been very exciting from the tech side. I think from the more business side, I think, the highlights really are that podcasting is still doing incredibly well, even under the economic downturn that we currently have. From what I see, the business is still growing. Yes, we're seeing cost cutting and stuff like that, but that is, I think, a little bit different. We're seeing more revenue coming into this space. And so hopefully seeing an awful lot more profit coming into this space as well. And I think that's really exciting, particularly given that one of the first things that goes when a recession comes or when a threatened recession comes is the ad budget. So very excited to see that is that podcasting is doing well. I think my highlight of things that haven't gone well has been the disappointment in Google and YouTube again. If you remember, about 3 years ago, we were hugely excited when Zach Renaud-Widen jumped in and launched Google Podcasts, and everybody was so excited, and we thought, oh yes, Google has come, the great big G has come to save the industry, and that was a complete damp squib because they didn't put any effort behind it, sadly, and exactly the same thing appears to be happening again in YouTube. You remember Podcast Movement LA, where the big head honcho of YouTube turns up, the new head of podcasting turns up, says absolutely nothing to a packed room. The only thing that they have done this year is they've launched something which they call a podcast's front page, but nobody can actually get listed in. It's just a random curated list of podcasts, and it only exists in the US and not in the other 179 countries. Hello, Google. So I think such a disappointment, and that could have been such a highlight. And Google once more have, completely wasted their effort and wasted their brand equity in just not bothering to do a good job, which is a real shame.
Yeah, no, that was the funniest thing, that packed room in LA. Come on, Kai, what are you going to say? Here we are. We're all ready for you. The big announcement.
It was brilliant, wasn't it? Absolutely brilliant. And absolutely nothing was said. And you could just see people going, oh, was that it? He's just going to stand there and say, we really like podcasters. Yeah, that was a thing. The
embarrassing moment of my year was actually going up to the YouTube stand at the London show, not looking at the badge of the person I was talking to and going, can I tell you what a waste of time that was in LA? And what are you going to do? Are you going to announce something only to look down at the badge to realise I was talking to Kai?
Yes.
So luckily he didn't know who I was.
I have a feeling he heard that from quite a lot of people. I ended up spending about 20 minutes with him on the sofa, and having a chat. But again, he was saying, oh, well, we'll have more news. And of course, none of that news has actually happened. I have to say the only sort of slight upside was that the PR person that got very upset with me for leaking the PowerPoint earlier on in the year, very, very upset, promised me an exclusive that never happened, of course. The only upside to that is he's no longer working there. So, karma. 2023, where do you think 2023 is going then, Sam?
Well, I'm thinking Joe Rogan's leaving Spotify and joining YouTube, and that's what we're waiting for. That's what YouTube's waiting for. Joe Rogan's contract to expire, and he will join YouTube for the big podcast announcement. That's what we're waiting for. But other than that, go on.
When does that contract expire?
Oh, I don't know. I've not spoken to Joe recently, or ever, should I say. No idea. But I know it's somewhere in 2023. It's not long. So
yeah, I think you're right. That's going to be really interesting to see if he re-signs with. Yes, it expires at the end of 2023. So we'll probably, about this time next year, we might find out whether or not he's signed up with YouTube, but that's still a long way to go.
So I'm predicting YouTube launch their podcasting platform in 2024. There you go. You heard it here first.
What else?
What else? Hosting companies are slowly realizing that hosting is now a commodity. I mean, I think from the list that you did last week, that you updated on hosting companies on Pod News, there's over 100 plus. I know John Spurlock's talked about how many podcasting companies who could be using OP3. So I think there's a lot of healthy ecosystem and competition, but it's not a differentiator. And I think they're going to have to start to look for more differentiators. And I think those podcasting hosting companies that adopt the podcast index tags faster will see traffic move away from a competition back to themselves. So it's going to be great to see who's bringing out Podcast TXT, who's going to support the value tag, and as you'll hear from Dave Jones later in this show, who's going to be supporting the new PodPing 2.0 live item tag. So I think there's a lot that hosting companies should and could be doing to add added value beyond just hosting your RSS feed. I mean, a good example is something that you and I, James, pretty much understand, but if you want to do live hosting or live podcasting, you need another server, a Shoutcast server, an Icecast server, or something that's going to broadcast your podcast live. Imagine if your podcasting host said, yeah, you've got your podcast with this. Yeah, we're going to distribute it to all the directories, but you want to do live, no problem. Here's the 2 tag fields you need to put, start and end date. And of course, yes, of course you can use our Shoutcast server, which is redundant if you had your own one 99% of the time. So you can use it for the 1% of the time that you're live broadcasting, and it's all just an added premium service. Now, that's the sort of thing I'm hoping hosting companies look at and start to offer podcasters in 2023.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And I think, I was looking around for whether or not I could shift the hosting of the main Pod News Daily and put that onto a, in inverted commas, proper podcasting host. And there was one or two that I was looking at for various complicated reasons, but neither of them support the podcast 2.0 tags that I want them to support. So I can't move. And I do wonder whether or not that's going to be a bigger deal for other podcasters as we go into 2023, where they would, sign with whatever company like Libsyn, for example. I mean, they're not going to do anything with podcasting 2.0. They've got somebody who hates it. So therefore, they're not going to do anything. When is that going to be a real restriction for growth for that company, the fact that they aren't going to support any of that? I find that fascinating. So it'll be really interesting to have a look. What else apart from the podcasting tags and stuff like that?
Yeah, well, my 4 tenets for podcasting are discovery, interactivity, and monetization. The fourth one has gone. So let's go with, there's the 3 tenets of podcasting there. The 4th has slipped away. It's early in the morning. But one of those in discovery is obviously having a better search engine, not just looking for title or search engines that might support things like the person tag or location tag would be great. The stuff that Dan Meisner found that Apple's been doing, which we talked about last week, within the metadata, adding stuff in so that they can either surface or recommend or check that the podcast is not doing naughty things. Whatever they're doing it for, we don't know yet, Apple. But it could be that they're building a better search engine, and I think the industry needs one. Google, as we've highlighted earlier today, has singularly failed to do anything for the podcasting industry in that way. We thought that Google would start to index podcasts and do much more for the industry. Seems to have not done it. And of course, as we said, YouTube, the big damp squid, haven't done anything either. So I do think there will be a new podcast search engine. Don't know if it's going to be Apple or somebody else.
Yes, it'll be interesting to look into. And I would agree that topics are really interesting and really exciting. And, again, I mean, Google is interested in making podcasts appear in the main index, which they've done quite successfully. But I think apart from that, there's no real, benefit from anything that they've been doing, which, again, is a bit of a shame. Well, what else do you see happening? Do you think there's going to be more podcasts next year?
I think there will still be a growth in podcasts. So there'll be new podcasters coming in as tools and technology makes it easier. But I also have noticed a lot of pod fade. That's sad. And I think that comes back down to people either not getting an audience or not getting any revenue. This reminds me of the early days of blogging. People did blogs and then they didn't find anyone commenting. They didn't find anyone interacting. And they were like, oh, why am I spending hours writing this thing when no one's reading it? And I wonder if in 2023 we don't start to use cross comments or boostergrams or make it so that people can get paid other than trying to find dynamic ad insertion or begging for sponsors.
Yeah.
So it will grow.
Yeah, it seems to me that cross-app comments are the real obvious benefit that they're great for podcast hosts because all of a sudden the podcasters that are on that platform can see that there are people listening, can see that there are people communicating with them. So they're great from that point of view. They're great from, obviously the podcasters themselves, but also really good for the listeners so that they can actually see that they are part of a tribe, so to speak, of other people who are using this. And, I would really push the podcast apps that are out there to implement cross-app comments because that is going to be a really big thing, but only if we get some kind of adoption of that.
Well, later in this show, you can use chapters to jump to it whenever you like, but I do interview Benjamin Bellamy both about his new support of OP3, but we also covered a good chunk about what is happening with Castopod and cross comments across the industry. So you can jump to that one later or just keep listening now. Now, the last couple of ones from me, James, and then we'll hear what yours are. I've already said it. Clubhouse, Twitter Spaces will fade. Spotify's already closed live. But I do think this gives the open podcasting community, us, the better chance of using live item tags. And I think, again, the work that Dave Jones has been doing with PodPing 2.0, again, we have an interview later on in the show with Dave, means that we've got a great opportunity to take control of this space and start to really give podcasters all sizes the chance to really do live item tag shows. Well,
yes, it'd be interesting to see what happens there. Maybe we should come back at the end of 2023 and work out how well we did. Oh gosh, we didn't do a prediction thing last year, did we? No, we didn't, because we were very clever because we just spoke to somebody else about it, didn't we? We spoke to Steve Pratt, I think, about it,
yes,
which was a very clever thing.
Much better. My last couple of then, I think a lot of old technologies that were around 10 years ago will be dusted off. We're beginning to see that anyway with ActivityPub, OAuth, WebFinger. I suspect we'll see a few more open standards being brought back into podcasting. And lastly, my big one, I think, for 23 is AI. I think AI is going to come more and more into podcasting, whether we like it or not. But I think it can be helpful in getting better transcriptions. We've seen OpenAI Whisper working with Descript. I'm going to be spending Christmas because I don't really go anywhere because we've got aging in-laws. So last year I spent time reading and learning about Web3, which was a great damn squid as well. This year I'm going to be diving into AI. So I'm going to be looking at Stability.AI and Jasper and a few other tools and just seeing what they do. One of the clever things that Stability.AI could do is based on the text, it can produce a dynamic cover art for you as an example. That would be quite amazing. So yeah, AI is my big 2023 bet. And yeah, more growth within the open podcasting community. James, what's coming up as a prediction in 23 for you, apart from Apple producing an Android podcast player?
Well, I mean, obviously Apple are going to produce an Android app because they're not stupid. So obviously they're going to be doing that. That's another 100,000 sats that I've lost this year to Adam Curry. 100,000 sats used to be quite big. Now it's actually not that much of an amount. So maybe I should give more. I am on the Podcasting 2.0 podcast at the end of this year, which I'm very much looking forward to doing. What else? I think there's definitely going to be more consolidation. I would suspect that we may well see a big podcast hosting company going bankrupt next year.
Wow.
I've got no inside information as to who that might be, but I do think that there is going to be, with the changing economic, circumstances that we're in, I do think that there's going to be one large company that all of a sudden realizes it can't make any money out of this and folds. So when that happens, you heard it here first.
You'll come back and edit this, will you, with his name? You'll just drop it in.
Yeah. And best not joke about a name now, because I think there are laws against that. Yes. So, but I do also think that hosting companies, as you said, will be differentiating much more on features, on value adds. Podcasting 2.0 is going to be part of that, but other things are going to be part of that as well. And I think it's going to be much less likely for you to have, such a great big list of different podcast hosts, and you're there going, well, who do I choose? They're all much of a muchness. I think that you will begin to see real differentiation between the podcasting hosting companies, and that's going to be a good thing, I think. In terms of possibly bad predictions, I think that ad load in podcasts is going to increase, particularly ad load in podcasts run by large American companies. And I think that is going to be a big mistake, and they shouldn't be doing that. But nevertheless, I'm sure that that's going to happen, which will probably kick off a bit of interest potentially in ad-free subscriptions, but also potentially a bit of interest in other automated ways to get rid of ads as well. So there may be some of that stuff coming next year. And I think the only other thing that I would say in terms of predictions is that I predict that the download will be a less valuable metric in 2023 than ever, and that a listen will be a much more valuable metric. And the question is, will a company like the IAB actually grab that opportunity with both hands and run with it, or whether or not the IAB will continue to bet the entire house on the download? And whether or not, the industry is going to continue talking about downloads when actually people are beginning to understand that a listen is a much more interesting piece of information.
Yeah, I mean, the Apple bug stroke feature that came out earlier in the year did show that about, what was it, 30% of downloads aren't listened to?
Yes, it was more than 30% on Apple Podcasts. So in total, it's about 13%. But yes, there is a certain amount of podcasts that aren't listened to. And of course, what that's doing is that's pushing Apple's numbers artificially higher than they should be, because you can't compare Apple Podcasts, which has a lot of automatic downloads, with Spotify that doesn't. Let's just take a quick break.
Looking to gain more insight on the automotive business? Download the Rocket Podcast, To the Point with Marcus Amick, where we dissect the topics driving the world of automotive sales and service. Available on Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and most other major podcast platforms.
Yeah, and the other one that you mentioned was you're saying a company might go out. Do you think there'll be lots of M&A in hosting companies? Because there's over 100 of them. Do we need 100 if they're all doing something very similar? Will there be a way of I guess one or two of them buying up market share through M&A.
Yeah, I think that there may be some of that goes on. I guess the question now is, what's the benefit of M&A in the podcast hosting market? Unless you're just doing that for scale, because you need 100,000 podcasts on your own platform. But unless you're doing that, to me, there's less benefit now than there's possibly ever been. But it could well be that we see some big, some more big acquisitions next year. I think probably the big acquisitions have happened, though. And I think when you look at the available podcast hosting companies which are out there, I mean, really, you're left with a very small amount of desirable companies. Clearly, one of those is Buzzsprout, our sponsor. One of those is Libsyn. And potentially one of those is Blueberry as well. Those are the three big, still independent companies. Libsyn has its own problems, so it may just be a Buzzsprout conversation and a Blueberry conversation, but perhaps there's things going on there that might be interesting for next year. I don't know.
Well, Apple, with their subscriptions, are requiring podcasters to host with them. Would Apple buy a hosting company in the same way that Spotify bought Anchor?
Yeah, I think what Apple have done, and they were supposed to have launched this in November. I understand it's now launching in January, is something called delegated delivery, which they're not going to be calling, which they're not going to be using that when it finally launches. But it's essentially the way for you to be able to use Buzzsprout, for example, and for Buzzsprout to upload that paid for subscription automatically to the Apple infrastructure. But yes, it still gets hosted at the end of the day by Apple. It's that kind of weird relationship that you have with Apple, where you can see them really getting behind RSS and getting behind the open RSS infrastructure in one side, but then on the other side doing all of this proprietary stuff, and whether it's their own lists of hosts and people on podcasts, or whether it's this a proprietary subscription platform. Interesting to watch Apple's sort of, yes, we like the open ecosystem, but we're still going to build our own small walled gardens as well.
Well, my last prediction is that Apple will open up the door. They're going to support Podcast TXT from the Podcast Index namespace. And on the back of that, they will start to look at the person tag and a few others. Maybe even go wild and support the transcript tag, James. But I think Apple are going to start to support the Podcast Index namespace. That's my prediction. So that's enough from me and James on our predictions, but we thought we'd ask some experts, not me and you, about what they thought about the 2022 highlights and their predictions for 23. So we started off with Mark Asquith from Captivate.
My personal podcasting highlight of 2022 has been seeing the newsagents hit 10 million downloads in under 4 months. And what a pleasure it has been to be a part of that team as a part of the wider global family. In 2023, my prediction is that we're going to start to see a lot of brands and a lot of creators who work on trying to open up higher rate CPMs. I think we're going to start to see them creating a better experience for the listener around the advertising space, around their brand partnerships, so that those, number one, higher rate CPMs can be opened up and really be shown to be delivering value. But number two, so that the listener experience is much more akin to that immersive experience that we expect throughout the rest of a podcast episode. So I think we're going to start to see the experience need to get better, because people are going to want to start to open up as creators, as podcast brands, are going to want to open up higher rate CPMs. And in order to do that, we are going to need to get a little bit more innovative.
Mark Asquith from Captivate, never knowingly under-promotioned, I notice, mentioning the fact that he hosts the news agents, and quite rightly. As we were saying earlier on, I think one of the concerns for next year is just a ever higher ad load, and he's absolutely right. Higher rate cost per thousands would be really good for next year. Benjamin Bellamy here from Adures and Castopod gives us his ideas for 2022 and 23.
With the acquisition of Twitter, 2022 was definitely the year when federated social networks, such as Mastodon, PixelFed, PeerTube, or even Castopod, became trendy for everyone, paving the way for podcast cross-app comments. I bet 2023 will be the year artificial intelligence becomes a reality for podcasters. For example, one could easily develop a new service that automatically creates podcast covers for each episode using automatic transcription, semantic analysis, and text-to-art generators.
Benjamin Bellamy there. Yeah, federated social networks. I mean, thank you, Elon, for smashing apart Twitter, for making everyone look at them again. And yeah, hopefully 23 we'll see a lot more. I tend to agree with him. And AI, again, yes, we both violently agree that that's going to be a big play, I think, into the world of podcasting. Now, moving on from Benjamin, we have Alban Brooke from Buzzsprout. And let's get his highlights of 22 and his predictions for 23.
My podcasting highlight from 2022 was actually making a silly podcasting tutorial video. We made it as if it was shot in 1993, and we had a ton of fun trying to replicate the old VHS style training videos, and it ended up getting a pretty nice response from a lot of our friends in the industry. My prediction for 2023 is we're going to see a lot of podcasters from the premier networks, some of the best production houses, and even shows that were previously exclusive to a single platform. I think we'll see people from all those groups go independent. There's a few different reasons, things pulling in this direction. One, networks are tightening their belts because of the recession. We're seeing lots of layoffs, and just generally the deals for exclusive shows seem to have gotten a little smaller. At the same time, Apple, Spotify, and others have made it much easier to sell premium content. And we're just seeing more creators start talking about the value of creative independence and owning your own IP so that you own the upside if a show ever does really well. So all three of those things pulling in the same direction. I think we'll see more creators who may previously have been employed full-time to make podcasts start to go independent.
Alban Brooke from Buzzsprout, I thought that was really interesting. One thing that he did say, which I would probably disagree with, is that Spotify has made it easy for you to sell premium content. Spotify, of course, launched their paid-for subscription service earlier on this year. To my knowledge and understanding, it's really gone nowhere. I contacted Spotify a few days ago and I asked, do you have any great stories about your subscription, your paid subscriptions? I noticed that in 2023, you're going to start charging creators 5%, I think. Is there a date for that? Sent off my request to Spotify for comment and, of course, heard nothing, which probably tells you quite a lot. But do you see that, Sam?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a bit of a fallout with Apple, actually. I think Apple are talking about, because of EU requirements, opening up the Apple Store and allowing third parties. I know that with audiobooks, Spotify was very unhappy with the way that people had to buy audiobooks. And I think you may have seen this week, James, Elon Musk's brought back Twitter Blue. I hope you're excited as nobody is. And he's got two charging models. If you go via the web, it's $8, and if you go via iOS, it's $11. He's basically making it very clear that there's an Apple tax if you go and use the Apple Store. And I think, again, a lot of other companies are going to be pushing hard along with the support of the EU. So, no, I don't think it's been easy. And I think Apple is going to have to open up the doors if they're not going to get a DOJ tap on the door as well.
Here's Harry Duran from podcast Junkies.
Hey, it's Harry Duran, host of Podcast Junkies and the Vertical Farming Podcast and founder of Fullcast. And my highlight for 2022 was learning about the possibilities of sponsorship beyond the CPM model. Through the Vertical Farming Podcast, I've been able to generate over $60K in sponsorship revenue for the show. And I think that speaks to the niche content being provided and the caliber of the guests being interviewed as I'm interviewing CEOs and founders of the leading vertical farming companies from around the world. I covered this topic at Podcast Movement earlier this year, and based on the feedback, it seems like a lot of podcasters are rethinking sponsorship and really refining the topics they talk about so that they can command a higher premium from their sponsors. It's an interesting space to watch. And my big prediction for 2023 will be a renewed focus on building communities around shows. There's certain podcasts that are doing this really, really well. And I think understanding who your listeners are, how they're engaging with the content, and what you can do to deepen those relationships is something that's really, really important and something that I think is going to be crucial for the growth of shows as new shows come online. Happy holidays and hope to see you at a podcast conference in the new year.
So there you go, Harry Duran. The sponsorship model that he did, again, is a really good case study. He did a presentation in LA, but it was right at the end of the event. So I know he was given a bigger audience slot at Dallas. Did you go to see Harry at all?
I didn't, but I've seen a write-up of the presentation that he did, and I think we linked to it from Pod News a while back. And it's a great story of, I was talking to a radio person earlier on today around radio being broadcast, trying to reach as many people as possible, and podcasting really benefiting from being niche. And actually the secret with podcasting, as Harry will tell you, is not to chase the big numbers, but is to chase that individual community and super serving that community. And I think he's absolutely right, in terms of that.
Now, friend of the show, Chris Messina, who's broken quite a few stories for us and given them to us. Let's see what he thought for 2022 and into 2023 as well.
Hey, what's up? It's Chris Messina from the Tech Meme Ride Home Experience. And my highlight for 2022 was getting to record a number of Twitter spaces throughout the year with our listeners, with our fans, with friends, with people from throughout the tech world to really make sense of a lot of the changes that have been going on in an otherwise pretty tough year. For 2023, I'm looking forward to seeing a lot more interesting artificial intelligence applications in the creative space, in the media space, in advertising, in movies and films, and of course, in the podcast world. We'll see if other things happen in decentralized payments and crypto and whether or not that comes back. Clearly, people are still building, and next year, I think we're going to see a lot of those efforts launch.
The very excellent Chris Messina. I hope he gets out of that box soon. Talking about AI and decentralized payments and stuff like that. Do you know, I'm always really interested around the conversation around decentralized payments and micropayments and everything else and programmable money. And it appears that quite a lot of it is being driven by people in the US who are all excited about what you could do if you had APIs to pay money via certain places. And I do wonder how much of that is being driven by just the old-fashionedness of the US banking system. It really is like going back 30 years. I invoiced for something a year or so ago, and an American company sent me a check. And it was, what do I do with this thing? What do I do with this piece of paper? I haven't seen
it framed up on a wall somewhere now.
I haven't seen a check forever. So I do wonder how much of the conversation around decentralized payments, around micropayments and programmatical money is just driven by the fact that the American banking system is so appallingly old-fashioned. But maybe that's just me. I don't know.
I love technology, but I'm very worried about central banks. They've got this mantra of the CBDCs, the central bank digital currency. And I think in Australia this week, James, they've made it a pre-requirement now to have a digital ID to buy Bitcoin or crypto. And potentially getting on the web. You will not be allowed on the web in Australia. A bit like China, unless you've presented up your digital ID.
Yes, well, I'm not sure that that's going to work. I mean, you can't get a mobile phone here without showing your normal ID. And that's been one of the problems that we've had over the last couple of months, is that all of that lovely data, which has sat in various telcos, has been a real exciting thing for hackers to get their hands on. And somebody got their hands on 100,000 people's records from Optus, and spread those across the internet. They actually got hold of 1.4 million, but 100,000 that they actually published on the internet. And that was a very, very bad thing. And it just goes to show that, yes, it's absolutely fine asking for people's IDs and storing those IDs, but then what happens when that data gets hacked? So
indeed,
all interesting stuff. Let's move on to Matt Mederios from Castos.
The shining star for me in 2022 was the Podcasting 2.0 movement. We saw a lot of new features shipped, further adoption across the industry, including here at Castos, and more awareness hitting actual podcast creators, not just tech-savvy folks. For 2023, I'd love to see the adoption double down across the industry, but my prediction is that we'll see a shift in tools and culture, that podcasters can go direct to listeners without being tied to a single platform. Largely thanks to Podcasting 2.0 painting that picture, we'll see some easier to adopt monetization tooling come to the podcast creators.
There we go, the wonderful Matt Medeiros. His brother's brilliant, though. He's a great singer. Have you heard his brother?
Oh, that's such a 1980s reference. That's quite a thing. Let's go back to sunny Canada, and here's a man with a radio voice from Bumper. Here's Dan Meisner.
My highlight of 2022 was finally seeing friends and colleagues and clients in person. My big prediction for 2023, audience growth will continue to be many podcasters' biggest challenge. Stuff that used to work won't work so well anymore, and the smartest podcast marketers will revisit and rewrite entire sections of their playbooks.
Dan Meisner from Bumper. It was wonderful to see him actually in the flesh in May in Toronto. That was a wonderful thing, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing him again this year at Radio Days North America, which will take place in early May in Toronto as part of Canadian Music Week.
And I'm going to ask him when I see him just to do me a voice recording. I don't know, I can go to sleep to that voice. It's lovely, isn't it? It's one of those. You should do audio books, Dan. If you're listening, forget Stephen Fry. Read the next Harry Potter, Dan. I'll be there.
There's a thing. Let's move on. Here is the brains behind OP3 and Livewire and many other exciting things, John Spurlock.
This is John Spurlock. I'm working hard on my new OP3 project here in Dallas, Texas. Looking back on last year, I just counted over 100 retail podcast hosting companies and platforms, which to me indicates a very healthy marketplace for great products on the podcaster side. One thing I predict we'll see in 2023 is that the duration, the length of podcast episodes will continue to get shorter.
Interesting. Shorter podcasts. A bit like this one, James.
Yes, he says it's already clocking over 1 hour for this podcast. He's a bright man. I had no idea he was actually based in Dallas in Texas, which explains a lot. Looking forward to hopefully seeing him again next year. From the US to the UK, and another man with a radio voice, he is Neil Velio.
Before I get into it, just want to say a massive thank you to the both of you for putting together this amazing podcast for us every week. And of course, James, with the daily pod news briefing. I know it can't be easy to commit to doing this week in, week out. Producing a weekly podcast is difficult enough, but the fact that you do it every day, James, is really testament to your passion for the industry. And on behalf of any podcasters who want to get on board with what I'm saying, a massive thank you on behalf of all of us. Okay, so the highlight. My highlight has been the suggestion of removing the use of the email tag by Apple Podcasts. I think this is a brilliant step forward for the industry. There's nothing more annoying than getting loads and loads of email spam in your inbox every single day by anybody even remotely attached to the podcast industry. It is being abused. I, for one, am really excited to see this end once and for all. Now, my prediction for 2023. Do you know, initially I was kind of with James on the idea that Apple Podcasts might launch an app for Android phones. I think I've changed my mind on that. I don't think they will because I don't think they feel like they need to. Here's my prediction then. A breakaway podcast category in Apple Podcasts and the other major directories. What do I mean by that? I think we're going to see a greater divide now between the indie podcast community and big podcasting. In other words, there will be separate categories for anybody that is NPR, iHeartMedia, the BBC, and a separate category entirely for everyone else. I think there will be two very different algorithms for those shows with very different requirements of triggering it.
What do you think of that, Sam?
Wow. Well, first of all, yeah, I do agree with him. You do a great job every day, so well done to you.
Yes, not that bit.
Sorry. I didn't know what you wanted me to say there. No, I agree. The removal of emails, great. Yeah, I think there will be a big split between podcasting and independent podcasting. I think people with budgets look at the newsagent, right? Massive success very quickly because of a big budget that they could apply to it. So, yeah, I think there will be a divide between the big ones and the little independent ones, yeah.
I think what worries me about this, having been involved in a fair amount of award ceremonies, and you get people going, give a special award for the indies. And you go, well, do you not think you're good enough to win some of the other awards then? Do you think that you need a special award for the little people because your product isn't good enough to win the big podcast prizes? That's what I hear when I hear people thinking that people want a indie versus big company thing. I'm kind of there going, I know what they're saying. They're saying that everybody should be given the same chances and all of that. But I also think that if we start splitting people up in terms of indies and non-indies, whatever that's supposed to mean, then I think that what we're actually saying there is that we're splitting podcasts up into the really good list and the not quite so good list. And I'm not sure how that benefits anybody, to be honest. But that's just me. And Neil has just said something very nice about me. So maybe I shouldn't have demolished his argument so much. Still, there we go. Who's next, Sam?
Jake Warren, good friend at Message Heard. He has his predictions for 2022 and 23, or his highlights for 22 and his predictions for 23.
Our 2022 highlight probably has to be winning the coveted Best True Crime Award at the British Podcast Awards this year for The Catch. My 2023 prediction is all around IP and specifically about how that IP is exploited. I think there's going to be less of a dependency upon commissions, which obviously, although you may retain some, if not all, of the IP of which has been generated, but you're also creating a gatekeeper for the exploitation of that IP. I think we're going to see much more of a collaborative model like we see in North America, where shows are created by and, which allows you to proactively engage with those looking to exploit IP from other mediums, and with the strength of proof of concept and proof of audience to go with it.
Jake from Message Heard, that's really interesting. Again, more talk about IP, echoing what Alban Brooke said earlier on, which is fascinating to hear. Now, hello, it's James from The Edit, and we did ask quite a few women, and unfortunately didn't get too many female voices, but one came in after we recorded, and it's the excellent Ariel Nissenblatt.
The highlight of my 2022 in the podcast space, there are so many great podcast-related things that happened, but I will shout this out. I traveled internationally a lot this year, and everywhere I went, I reached out to podcast industry folks to get a coffee and to just hang out and talk about podcasting and audio. In Malaysia, of course, I was at Radio Days Asia. In Europe, I met with folks in Berlin and Paris, and when I was in London, I organized a meetup for podcast folks at a pub, and this podcast's own Sam Sethi helped us find that pub, so thank you to Sam. It was a really great night. In 2023, I'm looking forward to more international podcast events. I'm excited to not only attend some of these events, but to also get a better grasp on the international podcast scene. I think there's a lot that U.S. podcast folks can learn from what's going on abroad. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute, James and Sam, and happy almost 2023.
So we'll end with one more bloke, and it is the pod sage himself, the mighty Dave Jones.
A highlight for 2022. Oh, gosh. I'd have to say the highlight would be live. It really changed how we do our show and brought an electricity to it, because now you had halfway to the vision to try to recreate the live stream experience of Super Chat. And so we're all of a sudden now we have chat, we have the live stream, and we have boostergrams coming in all at the same time. That really lit a fire under us and the Podcasting 2.0 project as a whole. It made things exciting. So I'd have to say that. 2023, I think my prediction is just more growth, more slow growth and more adoption. I was just doing some sort of historical lookups about HTML and the early web. And I was remembering, I have this folder that's got a bunch of old copies of Internet Explorer in it. And I fired up like Internet Explorer 1 and 2. And they looked so bad. And I was remembering, HTML 2.0 had like, 7 tags in it or something like that. And at the time, publishers like Adobe and people who were in PostScript, they would look at something like that and it's like, that's a joke. That's a waste of our time. It can't even do, X% of what we can do with our platforms. But the slow march forward over the year after year of adoption and improvement and open source contribution, within time, they met and exceeded the capabilities of the publishing platform. And because it was open, it just took off. So I think that's what this thing is going to be. It's what Podcasting 2.0 will be ultimately. It will be a slow, relentless march forward for adoption and features. And I think I already know privately at least one other hosting company is going to be jumping on board. So it's looking good for 23. I think we're just going to see the continued growth.
Dave Jones from the Podcast Index. He's a very bright man, and it was great meeting him in Dallas, Texas earlier on in the year. And I completely agree with how rubbish things were when they first started. I reshared a post today on Mastodon, which was a picture of Netscape, if you remember that, from I think it was Netscape version 1, yes. Sam Sethi. And
yeah, sorry, that wasn't my fault totally. I joined straight after that. Made it much better once I joined.
But the first version of Netscape was utter rubbish. I mean, really, looking at it now, it looks like the oldest thing in the world, and it was fascinating. And Dave Jones makes such a good point. Of course, mind-bendingly different at the time, but looking back at it now, we've moved on so far. So I think Dave actually makes a great point there.
Yeah, James, look, stick with it. http://www. It's going to be the future. I remember saying those words.
It certainly is.
Anyway, yes.
Now, let's go on to People News. Callum Clark is the new head of podcasts for UK and Ireland at Apple. He used to work for Sony Music Entertainment and at Global, and in fact was a radio DJ a long time ago. Good to see him in post. Dave Jackson has been promoted to head of education at Libsyn, which is the job he was born to do, I reckon. He's a podcast Hall of Famer. He's worked for Libsyn since 2016. He's got a background as a trainer, and he's a very good man, so many congratulations to him. Liz Hames has joined Jar Audio as Director of Podcast Marketing. She comes from Pacific Content and CBC. Leandro Saucedo, who's Acast's Chief Business and Strategy Officer, has left Acast. He just says, I've got a few ideas of what to do next, which is always interesting when people say that, isn't it? And Stephen Michael has joined Wolf Entertainment as VP of Audio. He joins from Gunpowder and Sky. If you're looking for a job, Pod News has podcasting jobs across the industry and across the world. They're free to post as well. It just takes 2 minutes to add a new role. So head on over to podnews.net/jobs.
The tech stuff on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Yes, it's the stuff you'll find every Monday in the Pod News newsletter. Here's where we do all of the tech talk. What have we got here, Sam?
Well, we talked about him earlier, the pod sage himself, Dave Jones. He put out a great Medium post this week about the updates to PodPing. He's been working busily in the background with Alex on making it simpler to use, and they've launched 2.0. I was looking back, actually. The PodPing 1.0 only came out on the 10th of January 2022, so it's been a rapid change in the podcast index. Anyway, the live item tag was formalized then. It's now been updated in PodPing 2.0, and I just thought I'd reach out to Dave and say, look, okay, mate, what have you done to make it easier, and how can we use it now across the industry? First of all, before we go into what's new, let's just backtrack a little bit. What is PodPing and why do we need it?
Yeah, so it's always good to catch back up on that because I've heard y'all talk lately about RSS Cloud. That's come back up from the virtual grave there. PodPing is a solution for polling feeds. That's what it was born as. So you can think of it as WebSub, which used to be called PubSub Hubbub, or RSS Cloud. RSS Cloud and WebSub are very similar in practice. They're almost interchangeable. They use the same basic concept of subscribing to a feed URL as a watcher. You say, okay, I want to know every time this feed has updated. And so you register that subscription with a hub, and it's either an RSS Cloud hub or a WebSub hub. And then that hub will tell you when the feed has changed. So you do know when to go poll it. And so you're not just polling randomly all day long. And so that's the problem those things we're trying to solve. There's inherent flaws with those, we felt, and the biggest one is that these hubs get overloaded. There's only a couple of them globally that serve millions of feeds, and that's a Superfeeder and Google's free hub. They have no incentive to keep them up. They're not making any money off them. So the WebSub RSS Cloud model, it's prone to those sorts of problems. You also have to keep resubscribing constantly, which can just eat up all your time. So there's more than that. That's just two of the main issues. So PodPing is returning to the old idea of back in the day. Apple had a way where you could say every time their feed updated, you could just let them know. You could ping them. And so PodPing is that idea. It's like, who knows when this feed changed? The hosting company knows. The publisher of the feed, they know. So they can let the world know in some way. The better way than a hub subscription model is to have some sort of publicly accessible rapid time series database, be a blockchain, whatever, that can receive pings from all publishers and just republish those pings in real time. And so at any moment you can see, as these ping events come in, you can say, okay, that feed updated, now that one updated, now that one updated. There's no subscription. You just watch. You just watch and wait. And so that was the idea, and it was working very good for the first few months. But yeah, it was working. But there was a couple of issues. So we always knew we wanted to expand it to have other reasons for sending an event. So it was limited by its ability. So all it would do is just take a feed URL. So all you could know is, okay, here's a feed URL that just showed up. We know the feed updated, but we don't know why. We don't know what changed. So the concept of a reason code came into the picture, where we released the live item tag to support live streams in podcast apps. But then if all you have is a feed URL, you have no way to tell, okay, this was just somebody published an episode, but then there's this other thing, okay, somebody just started a live stream. So the reason code was the main thrust of PodPing 2.0. We went in and added support for reason code. So now publishers, let's just say that you're a Buzzsprout or Blueberry or Transistor, you can send an update ping, which is the default. And now you can send a ping with a feed URL and a reason code of live or live end to know when a live stream started and stopped. So that was the main thrust. We did a lot of other work on the back end to re-engineer stuff and make it better along the way. But that was really the main goal, is to get those reason codes.
So which of the hosts now have user interfaces to allow us to fill in those fields? Does anyone implemented that yet.
This is all hot off the press, so nobody has implemented the live code. Now, the other part of that, you have the reason codes, which are update, live end. You also have another bit of information that can go into the PodPing 2.0 messages, which are mediums. So we have this thing called the medium tag, and it's listed in the namespace. And you know about this, Sam. The medium tag, it gets confused with category. People think about, okay, a category of audiobook or a category of film, that kind of thing. That's not what medium is. Medium is something altogether different. Medium is the idea of what is this content, not what it's about, but what is it? Is this content a podcast, spoken word? Is this content an audiobook? Is it someone reading a book to you? Is this content video, somebody doing a video podcast? Is this content film? Is this a movie? Is this music? Like, is this actually a music track and not a podcast? So once you have those mediums in place, then it gives the app the information it needs to differentiate between different types of content, not different categories, but different whole types of content. So you can have a podcast app that's just a music player, and it's reading podcasts and playing podcasts, but the only podcasts it's interested in are podcasts that are music tracks. And so you can combine these things together and say, okay, I as a music artist, I have a podcast that I usually publish my music tracks to, but for this one event, I want to actually do a live podcast where I play my music live for my listeners, for my audience. You can now send the PodPing where it's live and medium equals music. So now all the apps in the world that are music-focused, oriented podcast apps, they can say, okay, hey, we got a live stream coming up of this podcaster. He's going to be playing a live concert. That's something that we've never really had before in any way, is the ability to on the fly differentiate between the type of content and the type of event that is about to happen. And it's all based in the feed. The RSS feed is the source of truth. And then the PodPing system allows you to globally notify apps that this thing has just occurred. So it's all new. No hosting companies have this yet, but I'm hoping this will get adopted soon.
Yeah, and as soon as they do, it will make life much, much easier for app developers to also implement it. I mean, it's always the chicken and egg, but in this case, it has to come from the host first, because unless the actual podcast creator can do something within a field to say this is the start and end time and date, then the app developer can't expose that because it's never in the RSS field. I know that you and Adam put it in manually, because I've looked at your RSS and it's in there. So we can look at your RSS and we can poll that and pull it manually. But yeah, it would be much, much nicer if hosts actually did it.
I think we've talked before, Sam, about how our chicken and egg breaking strategy has always been focusing on the hosting companies, because we have great relationships with those guys, and a lot of them are forward looking and they want features to give to their customers. And so we can drive adoption through, we can crack the hosting company egg, and then the apps will have content to pull in. This live stream thing, this may be an example of something that's primarily app driven, because there's not a lot of podcasters that want to do live. And when I say there's not a lot, that's a guess, because we really don't know. These hosting companies don't have the facility for the most part to do that. The only one I know of, and it's surprising to me that they haven't adopted any of this sooner, is Podbean. I think Podbean has always been focused on live, so it's kind of surprising to me that they haven't explored this, but they're an outlier. I think most of the hosting companies don't really have a strong presence for live, so we don't know. There could be a lot of podcasters out there that want to do live streams, but we just don't know yet. But we do know this: you have people out there who are podcast app developers, thinking about people like Marco, who also are podcasters and do a live show. So a lot of the apps have an incentive to support live streams, maybe above and beyond the hosting companies. So we may see this thing being adopted first by apps, And then because it's just a really great feature, and there is enough content out there's a dozen or so shows that are using the live item tag now. There's enough content to where an app developer can say, this would be really cool to provide to my listeners. And the thing that we do know about podcasts, about shows that do a live stream, is those audiences for those shows are highly committed to the live experience. They really love it. I mean, they'll get Accidental Tech or No Agenda or Mere Mortals. These shows have sometimes thousands of people listening in to their live broadcast. So that's a strong incentive to see this happen in the app. So we actually may see a reverse here.
Yeah, it's my Friday night. You guys have been away for a couple of weeks. It's been really sad for me. Friday night with Dave and Adam, a glass of red wine, sat down, 7 p.m. UK time. And where were you for 2 weeks? I know
you had to pay attention to your kids for the first time, Sam.
Oh, mate, they're old enough. They can go off and do what they like. They're gone. I'm an empty nester at the weekend. Okay. No, anyway, the one thing that's missing in the conversation, I guess, is how do you actually do live? And you and I will know. So, for example, you'll need a Shoutcast or an Icecast server to actually broadcast live. And again, it just struck me, as a host provider, why didn't you add that as an extra service on top of what you... So yes, I will host your podcast and allow people to pull on the RSS, but actually, as an extra feature, I will give you access to a Shoutcast server. So now you can actually put your podcast, as opposed to I have to go and find a third party, another one, to actually get my live broadcast live, and then go back to my host to then put in my tags to tell it when it starts and ends. Why can't I do it all in one place? And it would be brilliant, because I know Todd said that he set his own one up. I'm sure Adam, I think, said he set one up for you guys. But it's redundant 90% of the time, because you're not live broadcasting every hour, every day. But
yeah,
a host could give
the idea that I've been throwing around, and nobody's really taken me up on it, is with how easy it is to spin up virtual servers these days, it would make sense to me that you could have a live capability on your platform, and then when somebody says they're going to go live, let's just say you keep 10 or 20 Icecast virtual servers running at any given time, and then you plug in right as you say, I'm going to go live, where you just hook into that stream at that moment, that server takes over and streams the content, and then it gets freed up for another user to use it after the fact. It doesn't seem that hard.
No, you know what? I have a radio station.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we do. So we have a Shoutcast server provided by a company called Radio King, and they've given us the credentials to connect to it. We use a piece of software called BUT, which stands for Broadcast Using This Thing. So it's a piece of software that sits on your Mac. And so what happens with all my radio shows, whether they're in studio or they're remote, because we have presenters who are remote, they just hit BUT. In effect, they're taking over control from their laptop or from the studio or from an outdoor broadcast to the server. So we can broadcast from anywhere in the world just using a laptop, a mixing desk, and BUT, because it goes to the server. And that's all you need. And it really is simple to do. But when people say you can do live broadcasting as a podcaster, I think sometimes, and I've not heard people talk about it too much, but I think we need to give them that extra bit of education that you need this server to do the last bit. So yes, you can go and update your RSS feed. Yes, you can go and broadcast like we're doing now. But this last bit of how do I take the recording that we're doing here and actually make it live, I would use, for example, BUT, free piece of software, connected to a Shoutcast server, which is configured with a password and port 80 and all the rest of it. And then people can just stream into it. And we do live radio shows in exactly that way.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Adam's been helping out this Dutch outfit called 100% Retro, and they're streaming live 24/7, and they have an RSS feed with the live item tag in it, and it works perfectly. I mean, I'm not going to say that it's easy from a technology standpoint, but what I'm trying to get at is the developer talent within podcast hosting companies. I know how good these guys are, and this is not a problem. They can do this easily.
Yeah, Alban, Kevin, if you're listening, spin up some Shoutcast servers, add it as an extra premium feature and charge for it, right? But have it there. In fact, if you look at Whooshka, Rob Lowenthal, that was sold to Spotify, sadly, what Rob was doing for me at the radio station was then taking the live feed that I was putting out and taking that stream and then converting that into a podcast on Spotify and Apple for me in real time.
Yeah, I think there's also partnerships that could be done with things like Squadcast or that kind of thing, where they have expertise in live or clean feed. They have expertise in the live experience of audio and video, and they could help the hosting companies facilitate this through partnerships, like you said, for a premium extra fee each month. And I go back to this idea that we don't know how many podcasters would do this, because it could be way more than we think. There's this idea out there that, to do a live show, you got to have all this talent and that kind of thing. Well, that's understandable, except we've seen from things like Twitter Spaces and Clubhouse, there's a lot of people that want to do it, and they're not concerned about having like this super slick polish and being a professional broadcaster. They just want to give it a shot, and maybe they have good information, and that's enough to drive people to listen to their stream. And as they do it, they'll get better at it over time. So I think there's enough interest that we've seen through things like Twitter Spaces where it's safe to assume that some percentage of the podcasters out there are wanting to give this a shot. And that gives me the compulsion to say, just go do something, put together something. And even if it ultimately doesn't become wildly successful in huge numbers, it's worth doing.
Well, I think you announcing PodPing 2.0 and the live item tag updates and the reason codes is interesting on the same day that Spotify announces that, through Ashley Carman at Bloomberg telling us, that they're killing the live capability that Spotify bought in. Twitter Spaces feels to me, just through observation, that it has reduced quite significantly in the number of people doing them. Clubhouse, I can't even remember anyone mentioning Clubhouse.
That's right.
For a day. Yeah. Hi, Clubhouse, if you're still there. But what I would say is, I think Spotify's crazy. Imagine brand new albums come out from your favorite artist and they go, hey, we're going to do a live session with the artist doing an AMA, and they're going to play some tracks live and they're going to tell you about the new album, but you can buy a ticket for it here. Everyone who loves their favorite artist would go, yep, that's me done. Right, I'm in, right? And Spotify can't see that and they're going to kill it. And I think what we're doing here with, well, I say we, the royal we, you, we're doing with PodPing and 2.0 and the live item tag is allowing that to happen outside of the closed wall of Spotify.
I think these closed walls are the things that hurt it the most, and I'm not surprised that they canned it for probably the same reason that Clubhouse and all these other ones go belly up, because it's just closed. We know that live broadcasts through things like Icecast servers, it's a thing that has been happening for years. That side of things is not new technology. And there's entire companies that are built on renting an Icecast server, on doing that. And so we know that there's a sustainable business model there because we've been seeing it for, 20 years? This stuff has been going on for a long time. We know that's there. When you put a wall around it and make people jump through hoops and make it proprietary, that's when you start excluding people from the audience, and that's when it gets challenging. So look at YouTube. YouTube is more open about this than most. It's still a wall, but they do say anybody can pretty much live broadcast and anybody can come and listen. It's the closest thing to open that we see, that and probably Twitch. And then you see the popularity of it. And so many people tune into live broadcasts on YouTube and Twitch. So we know there's an audience there, and we know there's people willing to dive in and do it. The one I like to use as an example is the Mere Mortals podcast in Australia. These guys, they're funny. They're not professional broadcasters in any way. They would not pretend to be, but they have a good time. They do it live every week, and they have lots of people that tune in and listen because it's just a couple of dudes having a great conversation about interesting topics. It doesn't have to be a knock your socks off, beautiful, polished recording. It can just be something that people are interested in. And once you get that live audience, there's a certain, like I said earlier, there's a certain percentage of the podcast listening world that just really loves that live experience. It's got a little bit of an electricity to it. Every week when we do it, like you said, we've got people commenting in the chat room. They want us to see their comment and talk about it on the show, and there's this interactivity. And I just think it's a missed opportunity if people don't dive in and start doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, congratulations. Now, where can everyone get hold of the new details about PodPing 2.0?
Read the blog post first and get some of those
Put that
details.
in the show notes.
Yeah. And one thing's on my to-do list is a self-service portal where you can go grab a token and that kind of thing yourself to start sending pod pings. That's not up yet, but we can definitely hook any publishers or platforms up with a token. If they need one, just reach out to me, Dave at podcastindex.org or on Mastodon, either one, and I'll definitely get you set up in short order.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dave.
All right. Thanks, Sam.
Dave Jones from the Podcast Index. Do you think more hosts should be adding support for live? It's a very different business model with very different tech requirements and stuff. But is this where things might be going?
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to Todd Cochran over on the New Media Show, and he was saying, look, I've got a Shoutcast server. It's not being used most of the time. Do you want to jump on it? In fact, with my radio station, that's what we did. We had a Shoutcast server from a company called Radio King, and all of our shows were broadcast using something called BUT on our local laptops. BUT stands for broadcast using this thing. It's a great piece of free software, and it just allows you to connect a Rodecaster direct through your laptop straight into a Shoutcast and out to the big bad world. Again, I think hosts should take some of that complexity and make it simple for people. So yeah, I really do hope they get on board with this as a new revenue stream.
Yeah, very nice. No, it sounds really interesting. A couple of other techie things going on. BBC has said that they will remove open Shoutcast streams for their radio stations. They are basically slapping you around the face and saying, no, you should be using our useless app called BBC Sounds. You can't have a listen on your preferred device, because even though you pay for our services, and even though in the UK, if you don't pay for our services, you will get taken to prison, we won't allow you to have a listen to our stuff on a Shoutcast server anymore. So tough. That's basically how that's going to work. I think that's a fair and not at all biased view there, Sam.
Ex-BBC. Very quickly, though, you might know more about this than I do. I knew about Shoutcast and Icecast, but I came across HTTP live streaming, or HLS, technology from Apple. Not heard about it, but that's what the BBC wants to be moving to as a means of live broadcasting. Is this something you've played with at all, James, in your radio world?
Yeah, I mean, HLS is pretty old technology. I mean, just to put a little bit of background on this, I was working at the BBC in 2007 to 2009, and they were talking about turning Shoutcast off back then. So the fact that they've spent so long waiting is, I think, testament to how fast the BBC moves, although I did very successfully nearly get to turn off the real audio streams. That was left to my successor. Yeah, gosh.
Wow.
But anyway, so HLS is really interesting, actually. It's chunked audio. So basically, instead of giving you a old-fashioned stream, as you get with Shoutcast, all that it basically does is it chunks bits of audio up to 5-second little chunks, and then runs a little program on your device that pulls those individual files together and stitches them together to allow you to listen to a radio station almost live. And it works really well. The benefit of doing that is that you can switch between different bandwidths and different audio qualities depending on how good your connection is. But the other benefit is that because you are essentially stitching together a live stream from a bunch of static files, it allows you to go back and listen to this show from the start, for example. So you can do some quite useful things with it. It's undoubtedly better technology. The question I think I have is, how much does it really cost the BBC to run the Shoutcast servers that it does? And is this is this a cost-cutting exercise, or is this actually just another grab for your audience data through the BBC Sounds app? And my understanding is that it is the latter. It's basically them wanting to get as much usage of their app that they possibly can. The HLS and Dash streams, what the blog post that they've put up there doesn't say is that you will need to sign an agreement to use those. So those won't be open for anybody to use. You'll need to actually go and sign a distribution agreement with the organization if you want to actually use those on your hardware. So it's one more example, unfortunately, of the BBC going against open technology, which is a great shame, I think.
Oh well, more people leaving the BBC then. Now, moving on, Livewire, the validator that you use on Pod News, now validates the podcast TXT tag.
Yes, and which is really good. It's a great validator, so well worth taking a look at. Libsyn has announced a new user interface. I don't see really where that new user interface is, but perhaps it's there, and I haven't seen it yet. They've also announced integration of Libsyn Studio, which is something that we spoke about on this very podcast around 3 or 4 weeks or so ago. But they are certainly moving on there, which is nice. Apple Podcasts has a fantastic social post generator where they've all of a sudden realized that there are more countries out there than just the English-speaking ones. So the tool now deals with 13 new languages. If you want to advertise advertise your podcast, then you can use that particular tool as well. There's a piece of work from PodTrack, which is really interesting, I think. I didn't know that they were basically storing global rankings for every single show in PodTrack. But that's what they've been doing for a while. They obviously only publish the US numbers, but they've got global numbers in there as well. And I'm curious to find out whether that information might be available to publish in the future. Who knows? But anyway, they are now showing you those in your account. If you're a paid PodTrack user, you need to be a Grow Your Show subscriber, apparently, whatever that means. And it also includes historical show level rankings as well.
Indeed. Now, last, Podlove, PodCloud and Castopod put out a press release this week with a transistor saying they all support OP3, which is brilliant news. And I thought I'd reach out to Benjamin Bellamy to find out what they've been doing and how easy it was to implement OP3. But we also had a wonderful conversation because of Castopod about how they're doing as well now that ActivityPub seems to be back in flavour and what's going on with cross comments.
Adures, the company that developed Castopod, the podcast hosting solution that we are developing, and some others, PodCloud, Podlove, and Transistor. From now on, we are supporting OP3.
What is OP3?
To make it very simple, OP3 is a system that allows you to get analytics for your audience measurements as a podcaster or as a hosting company.
Okay, so it's the Open Podcast Prefix project, which I've always found a mouthful, which John Spurlock initiated back in the summer. Why did we need OP3?
It's not that we need OP3 because there are many systems that are already working right now for audience measurement. For instance, there is one embed in Castopod. So we already provide a system for analytics for a podcaster who are using Castopod. There are many others. We hear a lot about IAB V2, which is not a tool, but a standard for audience measurement. There are many others. We know Chartable, who was bought by Spotify. There are PodTrack. The thing that is a real game changer about OP3 is that it is open source. So everyone can see and check how it works and what data it fetches and how it was developed. Because OP3 is also very nice to your private data. So it does not collect a huge amount of data, just what is necessary. And it is RGPD compliant. And it is also open data, meaning the data are available to everyone. So eventually, it will allow the whole industry to have very good data and numbers that will allow everyone to compare, to see. Since the data is open, you are sure that you won't have to pay for a subscription to get your own data back, which is something that we already saw in the podcasting industry. So you'll be able to get really interesting data about the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, that's the goal, isn't it? I suppose the big elephants in the room, Apple and Spotify, have their own vast data and they don't make that publicly available, whereas the rest of the ecosystem is working together to try and create an alternative data source for measurement. Now, how hard was it to implement OP3?
So, just before talking about implementation, but what you just said, the problem about Apple and Spotify having their own system is that first, it's a closed silo. So you don't know what's in there. You have no access to it. And you don't know if you can really compare them together. So having a system that is like in between or connecting all the dots together allows you to make real comparisons between different systems. And it's free because you could say that, with Chartable, it's the same. Basically, it works the same way, so you could have the same data. But if you want, you won't be able to compare data with Chartable because it's not open at all. So the fact that it is open data is the game changer here. Now, regarding implementation, as a podcast hosting company or a podcast hosting solution, it's very easy. It's just another prefix system. I think that some podcast hosting solution already allow you to use it because their podcast prefix system is generic in a sense that you can use anyone you want to. So it cannot be easier to implement it, actually.
Good. That's what we'd like to hear. Now, changing tack slightly. So one of the things that we've interviewed you throughout 2022 is for your work with ActivityPub and the open standards that you've been working on there with Castopod. Also, your work behind cross comments, which is using the ActivityPub protocol. So you must be very happy with all that's been happening in the last couple of months with the resurgence in Mastodon, the decentralization of conversations away from Twitter. Have you seen much activity for Castopod and an uplift in activity with cross comments?
Yeah, definitely, of course. This drew many attention on to Castopod because there were only a few of us knowing about the Fediverse and ActivityPub and Mastodon before Twitter was bought by Elon. So the fact that some people are now worried about this and looking for alternatives, it's a good thing for us. Right now, there are more and more people on the Fediverse, not necessarily Mastodon, but also on Pleroma and Selfed, Mobilizon, Funkwhale. There are many systems on the Fediverse. And Castopod is just one of them. So the fact that people are now interested in that and wondering what is this about? Why is it so complicated? There must be a reason why. And actually, there is a reason why. Is that, you can choose the entry points from where you'll connect to the Fediverse, and then you'll be able to grab information from everywhere. So definitely, yes, we saw many new users interested in that. I can give you some numbers. We communicate on many social networks, on Twitter, of course, and on Mastodon as well. And on Mastodon, we used to have 1,000 followers, and now we have 2,000 within 3 weeks. It took 2 years for the first 1,000. So that gives you an idea of how quickly things are evolving right now.
So from my understanding, within Castopod, you've already obviously integrated cross comments so that when somebody creates a podcast episode, they can put a URL linked for where the comment thread will go. Is this something that is going to come to other hosts, do you think, now? I mean, I know Buzzsprout are looking at it. I know a few other hosting companies looking at it. What do you think?
I think it should. I don't know if it will, but I think it should, definitely. The thing behind cross-comment is that we needed to make somehow a link between your community on the Fediverse and your community on the podcast listening apps. So that a user listening to a podcast on a mobile phone using a specific app, let's say, a Podcast Addict, needed a way to know where to interact, because Podcast Addict doesn't know about the Fediverse and doesn't know where the entry point is. So the cross-comment tag at the beginning was here to allow that, to say, hey, this is where the interaction takes place. It can be on the Fediverse, but it can be something else, because the Fediverse is not the whole universe. It's just a small part of it. And the idea behind this is that a podcaster should be free to choose where he or she wants to interact with the audience. And that's what this is about. So, of course, having developed Castopod, which is on the Fediverse, we implement the cross-comment apps on the Fediverse. But you can have many other things.
One thing, when I look back at the W3 standard for ActivityPub, I noticed that the way that it's described is an inbox-outbox mechanism, much like an email more than a comment thread. Would it have been better, because we've got boostergrams as well, would it have been better to have called this cross-messaging? I mean, I'm just speculating, because of the analogy of, I guess, the email string that it looks like, at samsethi @podcastindex.social. Was that ever a consideration, or was it always going to be a comment?
I must admit, I'm really bad with giving names. So, yeah, maybe cross-comments is not the best. I haven't thought about that. Regarding the boostergrams, I think we have two different use cases here. Boostergram is made so that you can interact real time from the audience to the podcaster, whereas the cross-comment is on a more slow pace, allowing listeners to interact together. The comments here are here to stay, so that eventually you may have a look at, who commented on this podcast episode like 3 weeks ago. So use cases are not the same. Now, is cross-comment the best name that we could come up with? Yeah, probably. I don't know. But I think we need the two of them. That's for sure. The whole idea behind the cross-comment tag is just to allow podcasters to be able to interact with their audience and the listeners to interact together with no middleman, with no one being able to cut you away from your audience.
I can see the difference. Now, finally, what is needed, or what will happen in ActivityPub / podcasting / Mastodon to make this easier? Is it just an implementation time frame, or is there some of the complexity that can be made even easier?
It's the usual chicken and egg problem here, because you need podcaster to use it, and you need hosting company to use it, and then you need the listening hub to use it, and it's a cross comment tag. If you have only one app and one server that are using it, you don't get anything new from that. So you may as well implement it on your local server, and that's it. So it's going to take time, and you need to convince as many listeners and podcasters and hosting companies and podcast app developers to implement it. And when we talk about ActivityPub, it's not the easiest protocol to implement. So it will take time. But I'm pretty confident that eventually it will prevail.
To sum up, really, Benjamin, OP3, it's in the latest build of Castopod now. It's already live.
Yeah, it is.
Or is there an update that has to happen? It's live. Brilliant. And obviously, Cross Comments is live as well. So where can people, if they want the latest version of Castopod to go and try all this, where would they go?
Castopod.org. They'll find everything there.
Lovely. Benjamin, thank you so much. Congratulations and happy Christmas.
Thank you. Merry Christmas to you.
Benjamin Bellamy from Adures and Castopod, and really interesting hearing from him. And of course, I should point out that Captivate also supports OP3 in its interface as well. And in case Todd is listening, yes, absolutely. Blueberry supports any prefix platform that there is out there. That's not the same as directly supporting OP3, which is what this story is all about, of OP3 actually appearing as a tick box in the podcast back end. So that's what all of this is all about. But really good to see those particular companies there. A few things going on around the world. One of them is I've been storing for the last 2 years geolocation information about press releases. And you might ask why. Well, I was curious to find out.
Exactly. I was going to ask why.
Well, I was curious to find out where the podcast industry is actually based in terms of where the press releases that I get are from. And I finally got round, after talking to Chris Krimitsos, actually, of the PodFest conference, which is next month in Florida, finally got round to producing a programmatic map of where the press releases are coming from. Obviously, Los Angeles and New York are where a lot of them come from, as well as from Florida as well, which is where Buzzsprout, our sponsor, is based. If you look into the UK, I thought that all of the news that we covered from the UK would be from London or from Manchester, but it's not. It's from all over the place, which is really interesting to see. And also looking at Australia, Melbourne and Sydney are the two big magnets of podcast news. So, you know, just an interesting piece of tech there that I threw together one evening, and it is being updated automatically every single day.
James, you and the mere mortals need to put out more press releases. How can you be losing to Sydney?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, Sydney, it's I was there, a couple of weeks ago. It's very dirty, very loud. OSHA's had a good year. They say that they have now more than 10,700 podcasts on the platform. Weirdly, I can only see 6,000 in the podcast index. I'm sure that there's a good reason for that. And they've achieved 167 million downloads in 2022, which is good. Some very, very beautiful projections and ads for Amazon Music, who managed to promote their shows right across London by projecting those ads onto places in London, very close to St Paul's Cathedral or the Millennium Bridge, very close to Oxford Street, all this kind of stuff. Really smart pieces of work. So if you missed that was on Monday. You should definitely have a look at Pod News for that day. It's the first Pod News that I've ever written that has been too long for Gmail.
Sorry.
So there's a thing.
Didn't know there was a limit.
Yes. If you write enough, then Gmail basically says, "Oh no, this is too long." You have to press another button to keep on reading. So it's bless you, Gmail.
Good to see the marketing people at Amazon having to spend their budget before the end of the year. So let's go and
Well, to be fair, it's the marketing people at Amazon in the UK who finally managed to pry some money out of the US, which is more to the point. I wanted to write something about how much work Amazon had been doing here. They also had a lot of advertising in Paris. So how much work Amazon was doing in Europe in terms of marketing as opposed to Apple. But then I thought, no, I'll just come over as being grumpy and anti-Apple. So probably don't want to end up doing that. And in Australia, Mamma Mia has joined the
Didn't they send you an iPhone again this year, James?
They have never sent me an iPhone or indeed anything. So there we are. Even when I went to visit their offices in LA, which I can't talk about because I've signed an NDA, but I can tell you that I got no goodies, not even a sticker. There we go. What more do you expect? And then finally, in Australia, Mamma Mia, which is the number one female-focused podcast network in this country, they've joined the Australian podcast ranker and then sent me a press release saying that they were the number one pure podcast company in the Australian podcast ranker, which was nice. So now we've got 3 number ones, because I also got a press release from SCA, from Listener, and from ARN's iHeart Podcast Network, who all said that they were number one, which is very nice. I didn't even bother copying and pasting them for this time, but always interesting when you get multiple people claiming that they're all number one. Yes, it's news from around the world.
Let's look at some events that are coming up for your diary. Podfest Expo, where your voice matters. Get yourself over to Orlando in Florida for January the 26th if you want to be there. I know Mark Asquith's going to be there. I'm sure the boys from Buzzsprout will be there as well, as it's in their backyard.
Yeah, and they're really spending a lot of time at that particular conference doing more for serious podcasters. So they are pretty well known for people who are brand new to the podcasting world, but they're also doing a lot more around serious, established shows as well. So it's well worth taking a look at that. It's not long now, just over a month in Orlando in Florida, which should be at least slightly warmer than the rest of the US is. There's Podcast Movement Evolutions, of course, in Las Vegas in early March, which I'm going to. There's also Radio Days Europe, which is in Prague this year at the end of March, which I'm going to, and the podcast show in London, which is May the 24th to the 25th, which should be very good, and both Sam and I are going to that too. And there are more events, both paid for and free, at Pod News, virtual events or events in a place with people. If you're organising something, tell the world about it. It's free to be listed at podnews.net/events.
Boostergram Corner on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Well, we've got a couple of boostergrams here, haven't we, Sam, that you have pulled out of your Albi account. And the very nice Dave Jones has let me off for not knowing that Rush was a Canadian band, I think.
Well, he did send you a Rush boost 2112. Yeah, we're not rockers, Dave, so clearly, well, I'm not. I don't know about you, James. I've never asked you of musical taste, actually. How is your Kylie collection? But no, I'm not a I'm an R&B man, so I wouldn't know where Rush came from or what they sing. So, but anyway, thank you for your boost.
Yes, thank you for the boost. He says, for a moment, I thought you referred to Rush as prog rock bollocks. I did. But clearly you must have been referring to Genesis. Oh, English band, of course. At least some of them.
Critic.
Yes, dreadful. And to the Justin at the Optimal Living Daily podcast, please add to the getyourown.com, that's right, Todd Fund. Also waiting to hear Sam's impression as well. This is where I impersonate Todd and Rob from the new media show podcast, getyourown.com. That's right, Todd. I actually got Todd saying, you've reminded me, I've got Todd saying, getyourown.com. That's right, James. I've actually got that now. He said that on a Geek News Central podcast a couple of days ago, and I mean to go in and clip that. So you've reminded me to end up doing that. It's a good podcast, and many congratulations to Rob, of course, for moving and getting a new and exciting job at Podbean.
Now, my impressions are pretty awful. I do an Indian accent really well, but it sounds Welsh after about 30 seconds. So I don't know what you can say about that.
I should hope you do an Indian accent really well.
I know, but whenever I start, I eventually end up going into this Welsh accent, and then so maybe I'll just do Tom Jones, the Indian version. There we go.
Well, there you go. Well, this has been a long show, but the benefit is that we have chapters, and the other benefit is, if you've not already worked this out, it's holiday time, so we are coming back in 2023. This is the last for 2022. What day should we come back on next year then, Sam?
Well, you had a little report from Podchaser who've analysed what's the best day to publish your podcast based on your category. And sadly, it says, for news and business podcasts, the most popular days are Monday through Thursday and not Friday, James. So
yes.
Maybe we need to have a review of what day we publish this podcast.
Well, no, I don't think we should. The Podchaser data was interesting because it was basically, it didn't necessarily say what day do shows do best. It said what day do shows in your podcast genre release new episodes. So it's basically data around just when people publish new episodes. Whereas Dan Meisner did some really good work, which was both when people release episodes over the holiday time and when people consume episodes over the holiday time as well. It's a great piece of work on the Bumper website. Should your podcast take a break for the holidays? It's probably not what it's called, but that's what I called it in the Pod News newsletter. But basically, he says if you decide to release podcast episodes towards the end of this month, know that it's a quieter but less crowded time of the year. Your downloads will likely soften a bit, and by soften a bit, I think he means go down, and actual consumption will likely be lower than at other times of the year. So, but it's a really good piece of research into both when people release shows over the holiday period, but also when people consume shows over the holiday period. Well worth a read. You'll find that at wearebumper.com.
Well, we decided to create this show as a double show, it feels like. I think we're into the second hour nearly, James, if we're not careful. So, yes.
But if you've got value from any of this, then, or you just like to send us a gift for the holidays, then the Pod News Weekly Review is separate from Pod News. Sam and I share everything from it. We really appreciate your support so that we can continue making this show. You can support us with cash at podnews.net/weekly support. Or you can support us with sats by hitting the boost button in your podcast app. If you don't have one of those, podnews.net/new podcast apps will help you find a new app like Fountain, for example. Have you been lunching with anybody exciting this week, Sam?
Well, me and my lunches, James, I've got to keep them up. Yeah, I went out with the head of AWS Europe, who's my old boss. So, yes.
So I've paid for that then?
How? Oh, yes, through your subscription. Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, because I spend so much with AWS and I spend it all in Dublin.
Oh, right. Well,
so
thank you for the fine bottle of red wine and very nice steak that I had with it. Yes, thank you, James.
Yeah. Who else did you talk to apart from your unnamed old boss?
Well, I won't name him. That's not fair. Also, I called up with Oscar Murray from Fountain. We had a wonderful chat. We went to the 5th floor of Waterstones, just off Piccadilly. It's a secret little cafe up there if you ever want to go to it.
Yes, it's lovely up there, isn't it?
It is nice.
They do very excellent cocktails, I seem to remember.
Yes, well, they did. We were very happy. It was cocktail hour. No, and we talked about what Fountain's doing, and we talked about the attention economy and micropayments, and where we think 2023 is going to be. So it was a very lovely chat.
Was he wearing a woolly hat?
He did come in with a woolly hat because it was very cold, but yes. I still don't quite understand why Oscar's avatar for everything he does is a cartoon crayon of him, but there you go.
Yeah.
I didn't ask him that question, so there you go. James, what's been happening for you? Come on.
Well, there we are. I think I've been having great fun piling through all of the data around the Apple Podcasts top podcasts around the world and looking at the different data that is there. It's, obviously the biggest podcast app in the world, and therefore, that's important information. And so I've been enjoying playing around with that, and also enjoying having chats with various people, recordings for various podcasts which will be coming out in the next couple of weeks, including one with Oxford Road in the new year, where I'm very rude about the IAB, possibly too rude. So I'm rather hoping that they're going to edit that out. But anyway, so that's been great fun. Basically, that's my week. It's also been very, very hot here. Sorry to rub it in, but it's been very, very hot here. So I've been very much dressing down, as you can tell. And that's it for this week.
Up.
Yes. And that's it for this week.
You can give us feedback using email at weekly@podnews.net, or you can send us a Boostergram. If your podcast app doesn't support Boost, then grab a new one from podnews.net/new podcast apps.
Congratulations for getting this far. This is our longest podcast ever. Our music is from Studio Dragonfly. Our voiceover is Sheila D. And we're hosted and sponsored by Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy.
A happy Christmas to you all and a happy New Year. We'll see you in the new one.
Get updated every day. Subscribe to our newsletter at podnews.net. Tell your friends and grow the show.
And support us.
The Pod News Weekly Review will return
next year.
Keep listening.